Hi, welcome to the first video episode of the Regenerate Media podcast. On this podcast, we'll explore notions of regenerative economy, economies that are in harmony with nature, and prioritize human health and the health of the planet. Tomorrow's regenerative economy will not be made of something that doesn't exist today. It will be made of today's imperfect world. It will be derived from the ingredients of today's institutions, today's culture, today's politics and economics. So I repeatedly quote Thich Nhat Hanh, who said, "The flower is made of non-flower elements. We can describe the flower as being full of everything. There is nothing that is not present in the flower. We see sunshine, we see the rain, we see clouds, we see the earth. We also see time and space in the flower. A flower, like everything else, is made entirely of non-flower elements." So Vermont is one place in the world that I'm focusing. I'm looking at Vermont saying, what exists today that shows us a way forward that is already in some form regenerative, or that could be given a change in the broader political economic context. I've been talking to people from around the world, including many indigenous communities, and I noticed recently that I don't know very much about the indigenous communities of Vermont. I decided to do some research, so this first video podcast is dealing with Vermont's first people, the Abenaki. And I want to focus in on one element in particular, which is our relationship to land. So it's often said that indigenous peoples didn't have or don't have this same relationship to land that we have, that they don't have land ownership. And I want to explore whether that's really true, because I think it's relevant for the institutions that we design today. So I'll be reading from In a State of Nature first. This is by Muller, Nicholas Muller, published in 1982. So this was at the time, as of 1982. The myth of Vermont as a no man's land, largely uninhabited by Indians, clings tenaciously to the fabric of Vermont historiography. The information necessary to sketch the murky details of a civilization which inhabited Vermont for centuries, between the retreat of the Great Ice and the advance of European settlement, has developed slowly and only recently submitted to synthesis. The first History of Vermont, published in 1794, devoted 2 chapters to Indians. These chapters, with subtitles which included gaming, dancing, drunkenness, cruelty, and the savage state unfavorable to all intellectual improvements, made no specific mention of the Indian occupation of Vermont. By the inclusion of material on Indians, however inaccurate, the book at least implied their existence in Vermont. Many subsequent treatments have ignored it, and others have denied their existence. In his popular History to 1791, Frederick F. Van de Water referred to trails by padded moccasins. These trails, he wrote, led to no long established villages within the land. They were the shortest and easiest ways across territory too wild for even red men to covet. In her influential book on Vermont tradition, Dorothy Canfield Fisher wrote confidently that for centuries Vermont had been empty and had not been for Indians a place of permanent habitation. The happy accident that no Indians lived in Vermont before the white people who settled has left, she fondly concluded, a tradition of cheerful peacefulness of relations between Indians and white people. The historical observations left by Samuel de Champlain and others, the narratives of Indian captivity, the records of the fur trade, and the accounts of the colonial wars fought over the Champlain corridor, all establish an Indian presence in Vermont after 1609. The artifacts, whether turned up by the plows of Vermont farmers, tumbling out of eroded stream banks, or carefully excavated by archaeologists, all point to extensive Indian occupation of Vermont prior to Champlain. The evidence firmly establishes that Paleo-Indians roamed Vermont after the glaciers of the last ice age retreated, and that their descendants through the Archaic and Woodland periods achieved in Vermont a civilization which flourished until it encountered the influence of European contact. Okay, so we were just hearing from Nicholas Muller about the early assumptions in the state of Vermont and in Vermont's history that the land of Vermont was uninhabited before colonial settlement. And really, that was entirely inaccurate. But I've decided to interject a small piece into this podcast, which is partially a disclaimer and partially adding some political context to this discussion. Part of the legacy of this erasure of Abenaki history is the fact that there are currently no federally recognized indigenous peoples in Vermont. There are now, as of 2010, several tribes which are considered recognized by the state of Vermont as being indigenous to Vermont. However, that's controversial. So in the State House over the last 4 years especially, indigenous leaders and also scholars, especially from Canada, are coming to Vermont and saying that the local Vermonters purporting to be Abenaki are not in fact connected to Abenaki ancestry. So their claim is that in the mid-1800s, many of these people moved to Vermont and are actually mostly migrants from France originally. This is sort of high stakes for these communities who through their Abenaki identity, might gain access to additional resources from the government, grants, but also, the remains of ancestors, potentially claim over sacred areas, and have recently participated in an educational curriculum about Abenaki history in Vermont. It may be somewhat controversial for me as a sort of poorly read, white guy to, even boldly tell others about my understanding, my reading of the Abenaki history. And I guess I'll just say my stance is one, I don't have a particularly well thought out stance, but two, I'm sort of following my curiosity here, and my opinion is that if anything, that we should sort of be better educated on the matter, and so I'm trying to participate in this. What I'll be discussing is more based on more broadly accepted history up until and through the early stages of colonial arrival. Okay, so now a bit of background. This is from Hands on the Land by Jan Albers. All right, the span of Native history running until the first contact with Europeans is generally divided into three periods. The Paleo-Indian from 9 to 7,000 BC, the Archaic from 7,000 to 900 BC, and the Woodland from 900 BC to 1600 AD. The Paleo-Indians were adept hunters. Because the post-glacial environment was initially geared to large herd animals, hunters worked in groups, stabbing the huge creatures with wooden spears tipped with stone. But big game lasted for less than 2,000 years after the final glacier melted. Mammoths and mastodons became extinct, and other animals like the musk ox moved north with the retreating tundra. Following that period, there was what's called the Archaic period. So the Archaic era saw the development of hunting and gathering societies adapted to new northern hardwood forests. Then, as the scrubby, cool, wet tundra and barren mountains slowly turned green and lush, new animals began to find homes in the forest. Bear, fox, raccoon, hare, and white-tailed deer. Some of them joined many in a feast of acorns, walnuts, elderberries, and other new vegetable bounty. The world of trees offered diversity Paleo-Indians had not enjoyed, and yet the early people found the hunting here far more challenging. Woolly mammoth and mastodon were relatively slow, docile, and easy to track. A large mammal could feed the whole hunting party for a week or a month. These small new animals were quicker and smarter, and the land offered more places to hide. Hunting generally had to be done more often, and plant foods helped the people over the lean times. The lore that makes successful hunting and gathering possible is gained over scores of generations and forms the basis of a vital education for each new wave of children. The woodland period is defined by the introduction of pottery, agriculture, increased trade, and mortuary ceremonialism. So I think this is, one of the very obvious points is that just understanding the natural world was a necessity for these populations. And, it would not be easy to be constantly depending on the local environment for all of your food and shelter needs. And so, it is through this necessity that a very robust and thorough knowledge of the landscape gets developed. There was this sort of slow evolution happening at this point in time with technology. Technology for spears and other stone tools used to hunt. And all of this involved trade. So some of the tools used would have been coming from great distances. But because these people were constantly on the move, they were not acquiring a lot of possessions. Corn, bean, and squash had begun in Central America around 5000 BC, and by 1500 BC, the ancestors of the Aztecs and Mayans were living in small towns and building temples. Agriculture and the more sedentary life pattern it requires were well established in Arizona, New Mexico, and the Midwest by 1000 BC. It took another 2,000 years for the planting of crops to come to New England. Agriculture soon became vital to native culture in Massachusetts and Connecticut, where it had long been established when Squanto taught the Pilgrims to grow corn. At the same time, around 1000 AD, it was first established in Vermont, so well after other places. On the lower Winooski River, the earliest evidence of corn and bean cultivation dates back to 1450. The more settled lifestyle associated with agriculture has in many cultures led to a new materialism, as people who did not have to move regularly were able to amass more goods. Ultimately, intensive agriculture leads to hierarchies, rank societies, and bureaucracies, and makes the growth of cities possible. Okay, and now finally to the Abenaki world in 1600. Again, I'm still reading from Hands on the Land, A History of the Vermont Landscape by Jan Albers. So these Indians, the Abenaki, came to be known as the Western Abenaki. Their territory covered most of Vermont, New Hampshire, and a portion of western Maine and southern Quebec. They spoke an Algonquin language, like their cousins, the Eastern Abenaki, who lived from Maine to Nova Scotia. As is so often the case with names, Abenaki was not what they called themselves, but what they were dubbed by neighboring tribe, Matagni. It means Dawnland people, because to the Montagnai, the Abenaki came from the east. Sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation here. The Abenaki called themselves the Elbno-Bak, which means the ordinary people. Okay, so by 1600, the Abenaki culture had found many ways of living in relative comfort in the forest environment. The trend towards staying in one place longer and growing crops was now well advanced. Villages had about 500 to 1,000 residents during the winter months, giving a total Vermont Abenaki population of perhaps 4,000 in the Champlain Valley and 2,000 in the Connecticut Valley. This was probably about 1/7 of the population density of southern New England, where more intensive native farming could support more people. And here we get into some of the sort of social and you could say political nuances of the time. So, although both Iroquois and Abenaki lived in villages of longhouses, the closest Iroquois tribe, the Mohawk, were far more dependent on agriculture. So, I believe they were to the west of Vermont. And like most agriculturists, the Mohawk were repeatedly more warlike than their hunting and gathering Abenaki counterparts. Agriculture tends to lead to ownership and the predatory behaviors that cause war. The Abenaki could also be brave warriors, but like most hunter-gatherers, they probably did not go looking for trouble. For the Iroquois, exhibiting bravery in war and having the ability to force your neighbors to pay a tribute was an essential part of the male self-image in a way that it was not for the Abenaki. And this author, Jan Albers, distinguishes the spirituality of the Mohawk with the Abenaki. While Mohawk tales, like those of their fellow Iroquois, tended toward recurring themes of aggression, sorcery, and cannibalism, the Abenaki had a gentler ethos. Okay, and again, I'll just interject here. There is a chance that part of the narrative of the peaceful Abenaki comes from that sort of more romanticized 20th century sort of retelling of the Abenaki story. Unfortunately, this is sort of beyond my knowledge and beyond my research. Okay, and now we'll get into more of the complexity of the ownership of land and the way that the Abenaki operated in the land. The Abenaki showed a high degree of understanding of control of animal populations. Each season, they might hunt only 1/4 of their territory so that game had a chance to make a comeback. In the dense forests of the harsh north, it was much more vital that they maintain this margin than it would have been for native peoples in Massachusetts or Connecticut. Southerners could better rely on agriculture during a bad hunting season. In the northern forest, an early frost might spell disaster if they depended too much on their produce. When the time for the hunt came, the hunters left camp on snowshoes, armed with spears and trained dogs. Large animals like deer and moose were easy to track and lacked mobility in the snow. Smaller mammals like squirrels and hares were also good prey this time of year. It was also a great advantage of winter hunting that meat could be frozen in large wooden troughs, then pulled by toboggan over the snow to camp. There, the women spent their time cooking and making clothing. Late in the winter, everyone moved back to the villages, where the women were in charge of tapping the maple trees and making syrup. The fish started to spawn in April. The tributaries of the Connecticut River were particularly full of salmon, and the Abenaki would gorge themselves on this richness. There was also a good bird hunting as migration began. Passenger pigeons were killed by the thousands. Almost nothing else was eaten while this spring bounty was at hand. The focus turned to the women in May when it was time to plant the fields. This tied everyone close to the village, where the men fished and the women tilled the soil and gathered wild plants. The autumn saw great preparations for the harsh weather ahead. Once the corn, beans, nuts, berries, and up to 200 different medicinal plants had been dried and stored for winter, the people again left their villages for deer camp. On the slopes of Camel's Hump or the paths through Lincoln Gap, they returned to their hunting territories to take enough game to last until February. The focus was on hunting deer and moose and trapping fur-bearing animals. It was as important to get warm hides to wear through the winter as it was to dry or smoke enough meat. When the snow came, it was back to the village to begin the cycle again. What's written here in the First Vermonters with Muller, in Vermont, there were several major bands of Western Abenakis, each of which was associated with a substantial village. These villages were located on the canoeable streams near a major body of water, the Connecticut River on the east and Lake Champlain on the west. So, favored locations for villages were high bluffs where one could see what was going on in the countryside nearby and where a sharp lookout could be kept for enemy raiders. The east side of a stream was preferred. This put the stream between the villagers and their traditional enemies, the Iroquois. It also took advantage of the prevailing westerly breezes to blow away summer insects. Palisades, which surrounded villages, provided further protection from attack. It was customary for all these people to spend the deepest and coldest part of the winter in their village, living on food that had been earlier prepared for this purpose. This included dried and smoked meat, maize, and wild plant foods such as sumac, dried raspberries, blackberries, elderberries, grapes, chokeberries, chestnuts, and butternuts. Basic to Western Abenaki life was a cyclical pattern of subsistence activities, which varied according to the season of the year. 4 seasons calculated by moons were recognized. Sometime after the midwinter feast, depending on the severity of the weather and the extent of remaining food reserves, the main hunting season began. Usually this was sometime in February, at which time everyone except the old and infirm left their village for the upland hunting territories. For the average village of about 500 people, there were roughly 25 such territories, each one averaging about 25 miles square. This permits a very rough estimate of population. So, hunting territories, contrary to popular belief, were not just vaguely defined tracts of wilderness over which people wandered and hunted at will. Rather, they were clearly defined. They were defined in terms of their core features, which in this case consisted of a system of trails related to watercourses. In the center of each hunting territory was a tributary system of a larger river, such as the Connecticut or Missisquoi. When not frozen, the tributary served as a transportation artery from which one could gain access to all parts of the territory. Usually there was a main trail associated with the principal tributary system. A second main trail ran at right angles to the first, bisecting it and dividing each hunting territory into quarters. Boundaries corresponded more or less to the divides between watersheds, but were not precisely defined. This allowed them to fluctuate, which they did from time to time, primarily in response to the amount of sedentary game species, such as beaver, available within them. Each hunting territory was controlled by a particular family band, whose trusteeship was indicated by the blazes employed to mark trails within the territory. No one else could hunt there or even trespass without the permission of the controlling family band, but such permissions really could not be denied to those members of other family bands who were relatives of those in the controlling band. Indeed, it is not really accurate to say that a family band actually owned its territory, at least in the modern sense of ownership. There could be no buying or selling of land. Indeed, it might also be said that the members of the band belonged to the territory, so close was their identification with it. Other game was hunted as chance afforded: bear, beaver, mink, muskrat, otter, and porcupine. They froze excess meat. All hunting was done by men. Women tended to the household chores of cooking and making clothing and utensils out of such materials as hides and furs, birch bark, and spruce root, ornamented with porcupine quills, moose hair, and paint. Accompanying the hunters were dogs, which served to indicate the proximity of game. They also helped hold animals at bay in the deep snow. Dogs had other uses as well. They could be eaten when, for whatever reason, meat was in short supply. For example, in the winter of 1663-64, substantial numbers of dogs were consumed at Fort Hill. So one of the things I wanted to talk about here just deals with really the notion of population and what it would take to have a regenerative economy. And I think so much of our effort is spent on imagining the institutions and the political economic structures that would facilitate a regenerative economy. It's kind of interesting to think or imagine what would happen if we just had far less pressure on the land. Now, of course, there are two factors in that pressure that we put on the land. So there are those pressures from population, and there are those pressures from just the pure amount of production and consumption. And some things are much more affected by production and consumption. For example, when it comes to carbon emissions that are destabilizing the climate, wealthy people who are flying on planes and driving and getting everything shipped to their house from Amazon, wealthy individuals have this way outsized impact on climate change. On the other hand, agricultural systems are going to be more evenly impacted by population. So while it's true that wealthy people tend to eat higher on the food chain, it's not so disproportionate. So everyone requires food, and right now we're able to maintain this food system that we have with a ton of inputs. So those inputs include water from beneath the ground, which are recharging. Rainwater is filtering into these aquifers at a much slower rate than they're being extracted. It depends on fertilizers. It depends on nutrient in the soil. And so all of these factors are hugely unsustainable and are putting a ton of pressure on Earth's ecosystems. It's sort of, a real exercise to imagine what it would take to actually not be putting pressure on those ecosystems in an unsustainable way. And it just happens to be the case that in many parts of the world, indigenous populations have stabilized at this about 25% of carrying capacity rate. So it could be that, that is just a product of supply and demand in ecosystems. And it could be that in some ways there are factors controlling this. So some of the factors that control this fertility rate in indigenous communities include Abenaki women were likely practicing extended breastfeeding, which naturally sort of space out birthing times. This is common where infant survival depends on prolonged maternal care. Abenaki communities were seasonally mobile, meaning that it just would not be that easy to be, bringing children everywhere they go, large groups of children. There could have been sort of forms of birth control, so late marriages, flexible marital patterns, abstinence or ritual separation during key periods, herbal knowledge that may have included birth control, or abortifacients. And then, of course, illnesses, food shortage, harsh winters, high infant mortality, war and conflict. All of these would impact the population. So, of course, there are going to be some external factors, but maybe there also were internal factors that sort of keep that population at a manageable rate. Agricultural societies could have this large surplus, and that just wouldn't be the case in these hunting and gathering societies. Okay, now I haven't actually done this research, but I just asked ChatGPT what would really be a truly sustainable population for the Earth. And I kind of pressed ChatGPT. So I said, I mean, like really sustainable, meaning we're not depleting the water supplies, soil, nutrients, etc. What would sort of true sustainability be? And ChatGPT replied, okay, if we were going to strip down everything to pure sustainability, meaning no aquifer depletion, no long-term soil depletion, no biodiversity loss, no reliance on non-renewable resources, we're talking well under a billion, somewhere between 500 million and a billion people. It kind of broke this up, so in the range of 100 to 500 million people, you could have this sort of decentralized land-based societies. From 500 million to a billion people, you'd kind of have a sustainable, renewable civilization with sort of built-in buffers. And 1.5 plus billion people really only works with extreme efficiency and global coordination. And, I was saying, what about when we account for the resilience required amidst destabilizing climate and other environmental conditions? And ChatGPT made the point that more than 1.5 billion requires such efficiency and global coordination that it's just unlikely that would work in a destabilizing climate. So I think it's always good to remember we're working toward this notion of a regenerative economy because so much of global ecosystems are going in the wrong direction. So pollutants are occurring faster than they're being filtered out, right? So there are all these trends that are going in the wrong direction. And to get back towards some point of sustainability, we'd have to be sort of in an even state. So extraction not exceeding regeneration and recycling, right? But when we think about this, it's good just to remember how far we might be from that point, even just from a population perspective. So if the state of Vermont or any given place says, okay, we're going to, take this challenge on our own, okay, how possible is that? Just, consider that Vermont being one of the least densely populated states in the United States is maybe 60 times more populated than it was before colonial arrival. So it's good just to keep this in mind, just in terms of understanding what's realistic and how far we have to go. So we're talking about change occurring over not just the next 5 years, but we're talking decades and centuries of change amidst what could be increasingly unstable global dynamics. Now, another thing I just wanted to point out as being interesting is this notion of, the extent to which indigenous people are letting nature regenerate in different ways. So rotating crops, rotating the land used for hunting. This is also sort of part of the confusion. When colonists arrive, they might say, oh, this land is totally uninhabited. Well, it may have been uninhabited to somebody that doesn't understand this rotational element or the use of the land in that way. And then just focusing again on that notion of the discussion on whether land should be owned and privatized. So there's a lot of sort of aspects of the modern environmental movement that focus on the failures of the current system. Now, the current system is defined by the private sector, by the maximization of the trade of commodities, which are built for private consumers on using private resources. So production and consumption are both sort of individual to individual, right? Resources are rarely owned by collectives in a true free market. This is problematic for ecosystems because ecological systems span these private property boundaries. Birds fly across private property boundaries and rivers flow through them. And so we have what economists would call externalities, that the market does not reflect some of the values, some of the underlying conditions that the economy depends on. So, all economic goods start as ecological resources, conditions, the ecosystem services that are provided by the earth. And for this reason, there is a lot of pushback on using modern institutions to shape nature, to put a value on nature, to attempt to achieve some, mitigation of pollution or conservation or regeneration. But I think it's just worth noting that among the Abenaki, and like many indigenous tribes around the world, land was not just this free-floating, nobody owns it, everybody goes wherever they want system. Land belonged to families and clans, or maybe it's not fair to say it belonged to them, but they were associated. And some people have written that, in fact, it was these clans and families that belonged to the land. In any case, there was a mutual relationship involving both extraction with hunting and stewardship. But among people, there was certainly an understanding that you could not just go onto somebody else's territory. So as we continue, I'll talk about some of the conflict that emerges as indigenous people are moving through each other's land, and how this is sort of made significantly worse with colonial expansion. So often ecological services are understood as being public goods rather than private goods. So climate mitigation, climate stability is good for everybody, right? It's not just good for some individuals. And it would be possible for only one person to own it and nobody else to. You couldn't say, you know what, I want a stable climate, so I'm going to spend 10% of my income on that. That only works if the entire globe is willing to spend an adequate amount, or regulate an adequate amount to make sure that the climate actually stabilizes. So for that reason, a lot of the emphasis within the environmental world has come to be on regulation and come to be on public land conservation and other things that sort of treat environmental goods as this commons. I think the question for the evolution of institutions as we know them is whether we can still have elements of the private sector, elements of the free market, but use the instruments at our disposal to change that relationship to land. So, how can we make it so that rather than owning land in the sense that you get to do anything you want to that land, can we make it so that you belong to the land, you have a relationship with the land, you have a responsibility toward that land? And I think that this sort of notion is how there's any conceivable chance for capitalism to evolve into something that is not ecologically destructive, but is potentially regenerative. Okay, now let's get a little bit onto what happened once the colonists arrived in Vermont. So, as I understand, you have some competing forces. You have the British, you have the French, and then once the states began to form, you have New York, you have New Hampshire, and Vermont, again, was this somewhat unsettled territory. Okay, so now I'll read from the Vermont Story, A History of the People of the Green Mountain State. And this was from the Vermont Historical Society, published in 1949 in Montpelier. And this is typical of something you might read before the sort of updated understanding of indigenous people here on the land. So, in the beginning, there was no Vermont. Of course, there were the wandering waters of the great Connecticut in search of the ocean, and the azure expanse of placid Lake Champlain, pouring its waters into the majestic St. Lawrence, also seaward bound. Between these waterways was a green-clad land studded with towering peaks and sparkling streams and populated by the bear and the beaver, along with probably a few men with skin of copper hue. There were no boundaries, as now, and the Indians of the St. Lawrence and Connecticut River valleys wandered freely across its well-stocked hunting grounds and occasionally camped long enough to plant some corn along the lush meadows of the Great Oxbow at Koo, or near the mouth at Otter Creek or the Winooski River. It's hard to know where Indians lived. The inquisitive shovel of the archaeologist has brought to the surface in many places flints, arrowheads, pottery, and even skeletons of men who inhabited the land for a while at least, centuries ago. But the northern Indian was ever a wanderer, and his residence in any one spot was usually of short duration. Thus, it was hard to say that at any particular spot in Vermont there lived a certain tribe. I think it's useful, one, to have these books that are sort of out of date with the modern understanding. So on the one hand, we can read this and know that science has progressed and our understanding has progressed to say that there was a more sophisticated and developed Abenaki presence in Vermont than this gives credit to. It was not just a few Indians sort of wandering around, right? And on the other hand, it's good to look through this lens. Sometimes it can provide some sort of kernel of truth that might not be presented. So disease likely wiped out as much as, say, 80% of the population of the Abenaki. And that would have been before there were real interactions between, face-to-face interactions. That would have just been the spread of disease among peoples. And that might have occurred over a period of about 100 years. And the next thing I'll point out is that it was not so simple as, say, the colonists versus the Indians. The Indians from various places all had their intertribal conflicts. So, here's an interesting story by which the Abenaki and the colonists were sort of grouped together. I'll start in the middle of the story. Eventually, as the Algonquins and their 3 white companions proceeded down the lake, they happened upon a large war party of Iroquois. Hurling insults across the water, the Redskins made careful arrangements for a battle on the morrow. Champlain and his men had kept carefully out of sight, and when at daybreak the opposing forces approached each other in careful formation, the whites were still artfully concealed among surrounding red men. At a signal, the ranks broke apart, and there stood revealed to the astonished Iroquois a strange white god dressed in shining raiment. He pointed at them a strange stick from whose end came thunder and lightning. Immediately 2 chiefs, clad in arrow-proof cotton and wooded armor, fell dead. The startled warriors released a barrage of arrows, but as thunder belched again from the forest to their side, they broke and ran, pursued by shrieking and delighted Algonquins who took many prisoners. One of these they tortured mercilessly until the disgusted Frenchman was granted the privilege of putting him out of his misery. The warriors of the Longhouse never forgave the French the shame of that day, yet historians who attribute to Champlain's act the blame for a century and a half of bloody warfare and massacre conveniently overlook the generations of enmity between Iroquois and Algonquin, as well as the age-old rivalries of France and Britain. It was inevitable that the French should ally themselves with the people among whom they had to live, and in the end defend them against the raids of their enemy. Okay, so here's just some of the complexity, and it won't all be linear, but as far back as the middle of the 15th century, under the leadership of the great chieftain Hiawatha, the retreating Iroquois tribes had formed themselves into a great confederacy of the 5 nations: the Senecas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Oyenidas. Sorry for butchering those. And nearest the whites, both French and English, the Mohawks. This league came to be known and feared as the Longhouse. Gaining strength from their unity, the Iroquois began to strike back at their old enemies, the Algonquins. just as the French began to settle among the latter tribes in the valley of the St. Lawrence. It was the white man's fate to share the fury of the vengeful invader with his red neighbors, and the settlements along the upper river dwelt in daily fear of the warriors of the Longhouse, whose canoe might appear stealthily from the mouth of the Richelieu River at any time. The French began the construction of a series of forts along the river. In 1689, the French and British nations collided in the beginning of what was to be a century of wars of empire. Into all of these, the people of New France and New England were drawn, until finally the colonials themselves continued to fight across ill-defined borders, even as the mother countries maintained a suspicious peace. During all this period, the blue waters of Champlain were stained with pools of red as rampaging Indians from one side or the other proceeded up or down the lake with the stumbling processions of weary captives. The Indians became both a bone of contention and a weapon of warfare between rival empires. Each struggled to divert the allegiance of the other's red allies and used its own to unloose bitter, bloody raids against the frontier settlements. One matched the other in atrocities, though the French excelled in ability to adapt themselves to and actually participate in Indian warfare. Yet it is significant that the first New England newspaper, Public Occurrences, was suppressed after one issue because of its vigorous charges of English mistreatment of the Indians. Extreme losses of the Iroquois in their struggles during the years 1689 to 1697 lessened their interest in fighting English colonial wars for her. Thus, when war broke out again in 1702, the wily French took care to provoke the Longhouse as little as possible, directing their raids against the New England frontier. Then the great tide of warfare turned across Vermont, for the ancient trails from St. Lawrence Valley to the rocky lands of New England lay across the Green Mountains. Okay, and now I'll read some more of In a State of Nature by Muller. Vermont's original inhabitants then suffered their share of catastrophic epidemics, which, along with chronic illnesses such as tuberculosis and other respiratory complaints, reduced native populations elsewhere in New England by 90%. Several of these epidemics preceded the founding of Fort Dummer, and even more preceded the 1763 influx of immigrants from the Puritan colonies of New England. By then, surely, there weren't many native Vermonters left. Another early consequence of European contact, less immediately disastrous to the natives, was the development of the fur trade. Two things about northeastern North America impressed the early Dutch, British, and French explorers: the vast quantities of codfish to be found in the offshore waters and the rich store of fur-bearing animals on the land. The fish they could get for themselves, but lacking knowledge of the country, the habits of fur-bearing animals, and the techniques for trapping them, they could obtain furs only through trade with the natives. The richest source of furs in all of North America was the St. Lawrence Great Lakes region, and here the French quickly established themselves with a string of trading posts. So intent on the fur trade were the French that for many years they allowed no settlement other than those required to sustain their trade. Any settlement beyond this, they felt, would complicate their dealing with the natives. Were it not for the establishment at Fort Orange by the Dutch in 1624, the French would have had the furs of the Great Lake regions to themselves. Besides inducing a shift in native economies from subsistence to commercial activities and altering traditional trade networks, the rise of the fur trade brought about a number of other changes in native cultures. Unless they were obtained through trade with other people, the furs which Western Abenaki traded to Europeans came from animals to be found within family hunting territories. As the rate of extraction of furs accelerated, attempts were made to more precisely allocate rights to the animals which supplied those furs. This was accomplished in part by a more precise definition of the boundaries of hunting territories. With this, the Western Abenaki concept of territoriality changed from one which bore no relation to the European concept of ownership of parcels of land, the boundaries of which are well defined, to one which did. In addition, just who was entitled to hunt and trap within those boundaries was more precisely spelled out. An effective device for restricting access to valued resources, frequently used by tribal peoples in all parts of the world, is a specified rule of descent. Thus, an Abenaki's right to hunt or trap fur-bearing animals within a specified territory seems to have depended more and more on the fact that his father hunted and trapped there. So apparently the French folks realized that missionaries were being invited into these regions, and they took full advantage of this and developed contacts kind of useful to the traders. As they proselytized, they were able to speak with eloquence of the heretical nature of the British, who had strayed from Catholicism. Heretics were evil, and good Catholics should have as little to do with them as possible. Among other things, they should trade their fur to good Catholic Frenchmen, even though, as was often the case, the British might be willing to pay higher prices. The French were extremely successful at converting native peoples, the Abenakis included, to Catholicism. Part of their success was undoubtedly owed to the epidemics which periodically killed so many people. Traditional cures, including those which involve shamanism, obviously offered no protection against these disasters, and this may have shaken the people's confidence in their traditional beliefs. By contrast, European medicines and rituals had the appearance of being effective against the new diseases. The French apparently would actually learn the language of the people among whom they worked. They also demanded less of the people for conversion than did at least the Puritans of New England. They promised their converts military protection against their enemies, the Iroquois of New York, and they just happened to be the allies of the British and competitors of the French in the trade for furs from the Great Lakes. Although participation in the fur trade was not initially disastrous to Vermont natives, it did ultimately work to their disadvantage. For one thing, their increasing dependence on Europeans, be they British or French, led eventually to the loss of both their traditional technology and worldview. With both went the people's ability to provide for their own basic material and spiritual needs. Although New England's fur trade was ultimately bound to fail anyway, its failure was undoubtedly hastened by warfare, which more and more interfered with trapping activities. Warfare was by no means absent in northeastern North America in pre-European times, but apparently it just picked up, and as a consequence of European settlement, the nature, tempo, and conduct of warfare changed drastically, with disastrous results for native people. Ultimately, the Abenaki aligned with the French, and the British sort of won that war, and so it is a combination of this factor along with the sort of sparse population and rotational use of the land that led the natives to be relatively written out of Vermont's history for a long period of time. I think one thing is that is important about sort of really understanding the truth of this indigenous and colonial interaction is that, you know, the Abenaki and the other indigenous people were not so terribly different from the Europeans in the sense that, they fought wars, they had relative institutions over who was allowed where on which land. They ultimately succumbed to sort of, a more settled, more trade-intensive way of life. And this kind of shows that this context, these institutions actually have a profound impact. But what was amazing about indigenous people in Vermont and elsewhere is their relationship to the land. So, the stories, the religion, the institutions, the behaviors that formed over these long periods of time, that evolutionary process of the culture is produces something special. So indigenous people could have divined any sort of story about their relationship with the land, but so often it is this notion of a Mother Earth, of a system of reciprocity, of sort of this deep understanding of the interrelationship between the people and the land, of the animation of other species and elements of the land that survives. And the question might not be whether it's a wrong or right. It might be whether those stories lead to the survival of the people and thus the long-term maintenance and sustainability of that culture and of those institutions and of those behaviors. So in a way, as fantastical as it might seem to, a white person or a person of modern civilization, this notion of Mother Earth or the notion of these alive elements in the natural world, this sort of spirituality. In another way, it's sort of incredibly well refined and sophisticated. It's not just circumstantial that there's such universality of these stories, and that these cultural elements have and almost religious elements have allowed for stable relationships between nature and people for so long. Modern economic systems sort of replace the need to make decisions. They replace the need for culture. They replace the need to have, trust between people. They replace the need to have this land ethos. But I think the question for capitalism and the question for us as a civilization is, can we leave nature out of it rather than reward people for who can extract the most from nature? Can we say, okay, let's try to settle human relationships somehow and define a different relationship with the land? So, how can we create institutions where we belong to the land, where we're expected to have a responsibility, a mutuality with the land? Can we create that within the sort of notions that we've developed around private property? And in the next podcast, I talk with Chris Kleiza, the author of this book, The Story of Vermont, Natural and Cultural History, about this a little bit, about how Vermont is moving forward to develop policies that change this relationship between private landholders and the land itself. And again, we're just looking for those kernels of possibility for what a regenerative economy could look like. It's, I think, clear that the modern system cannot survive too much longer, just given the pressures that we're putting on the earth. And so we're really aiming at that notion of a transformation toward a different political economic system, toward a regenerative economy. And I think there is a lot to celebrate from the history here, whether it's modern political institutions or our indigenous people that lived on this land in sustainability and mutuality with the land for hundreds and thousands of years before colonial arrival. So that's all for this episode. Thanks for tuning in to the Regenerate Media Podcast.